verge of going into government. Now, just to start with a couple of big picture points. I read a report the other day that climate emissions may be down 12% in the state this year, not because of any actions by the government, but because of the virus, somewhat like we had 10 years ago when we had declines in carbon emissions because of the crash in the economy, rather than anything that a Conservative government did. Government's record is more accurately shown by the fact that carbon emissions in this state are the third highest in the EU, only behind Estonia and I think Luxembourg. They are more than double the carbon emissions per capita of Sweden. The country is on track for billions of euro worth of fines in 2030 for not reaching targets. I read that the EU average for the amount of land under forestation is 35%. In Ireland, it's less than a third of that. Now, if the Greens go into government, presumably the idea will be promoted that this will make a radical difference. There are two issues. One, will the policies go far enough? And number two, will they be just? I only have time to deal with the justice issue today. I believe that they will not go far enough because it will be within the framework of a market economy, which will put profit before the environment. But presumably, if the Greens go into government, there will be some more policies wheeled out, packaged as measures to tackle the crisis. Now, will there be justice in relation to those policies? We saw under the last government and the caretaker government the lack of justice towards the Borden-Amona workers in Shannonbridge and Lanesborough, who had consented to the closure of their peat burning stations, who sacrificed their jobs for the greater good. They had a promise of a just transition, but for a long, long time, Borden-Amona refused to set up a forum. There was a real prospect of workers and communities being left behind. There was a suspicion of an agenda of deunionisation, and it was only when the workers raised their voice and protested, like the demonstrations that were called during the general election campaign, that forced some change on that issue, and we'll be watching that one very carefully with the new government. But the big issue is going to be the question of carbon tax, €26 per tonne at the moment. The previous government wanted up to €80 per tonne by 2030. The Greens, I believe, wanted at €100 per tonne. We're opposed to the idea of a carbon tax, certainly a carbon tax on ordinary people. If you want to put a carbon tax on big business, that's a different matter. 71% of carbon emissions in the world since 1988 have come from a mere 100 corporations. But in the government talks, I understand that the Greens went in with a policy of a fee and dividend model. In other words, you pay the carbon tax and then you get money refunded. It at least allows for the possibility of something like refunds for the majority of ordinary people while leaving the carbon tax on the richest within a society, or of wealth taxes to provide refunds for people who have paid. It was rather different from the model that was being argued by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the so-called hypothecated model, where everyone is charged the carbon tax and then is ring-fenced for environmental policies. In other words, a policy which makes ordinary people pay. I wouldn't say that the fee and dividend model was progressive. It's a phrase that's sometimes used, but it was certainly less reactionary than the model being argued by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. But we had quite a few press reports in recent days that the Greens have conceded on this issue. Maybe some money to be given back to people on social welfare, but that would be the exception rather than the rule. In other words, have signed up to what is clearly a regressive tax. And just want to make it very clear that that's something that won't just be opposed from these benches, but will be opposed by ordinary people, as was the case in France. And the final point I would make to the Green negotiators is, I'm reading about liquefied natural gas being a no-no in Shannon. I hope that that's the case. I hope it's true for everywhere else in the country, including Cork, where there are plans for it as well.